Welcome everybody. Brother Dan Goodwin here, God's Final Jubilee Ministries, God's Final Jubilee program. Welcome to the show today. Glad you're here. And we're going to be real brief tonight. Basically, I want to do a little lesson on the three harvests in Bible days in Israel. Very important to prophecy people. Very important to understand the three harvests if you're going to understand end time events and the timing of those events. And we'll show you that. We also would like to have your feedback. We've got, as you can see, where our studio is evolving. If you watched on Sunday night, 2 days ago, you saw a white background back there, and you saw a smaller screen over here. I told you that we were getting a bigger screen, and this is it. We'd like to have your feedback. Want to know how the audio is. Especially want to know how well this thing here is doing. I'll only move that a little and just see if it makes a difference. It doesn't. Okay. We're still playing with things, trying to get the best setup that we can. So here's the studio of the God's Final Jubilee Ministries and what you can see of it here. And so we'd like to have your feedback if you see anything that doesn't look good, or maybe the lighting's not right, maybe the screen doesn't show up. We'd like to have some feedback on that. So I thought I would do a little brief lesson on the three harvests, and they all are right inside of this. The slides that I'm going to show you are inside this DVD set called Prophecy Unsealed, Volume 1. There are 2 discs in here. There are 4 PowerPoint presentations. These are actually part of one of those. So the 7 Feast is Session 1. The Jubilee is Session 2. Session 3 is the Barley Harvest. And I think, in fact, this what you're seeing here is a part of that session. Session 4, When Time Shall Be No More, probably the most exciting one on here. We have these are available on the website, godsfinaljubilee.com. Just go there. This is there. The new book is there, The Mystery of the Jubilee. And some of the old books are there as well. So I want to encourage you to do that. So let's jump right into this. I want to share with you about the three harvests. And you can see on the screen that is a barley harvest. And we're going to be looking at what that's all about, what it means, and tonight. So let's jump right into it. In Israel, everything revolves around the barley harvest. I like to think that that could be Ruth out in the fields of Boaz, and she's gleaning, and she's poor. Her mother-in-law Naomi is poor. They owe debts, and they've come back after 20 years, and she's gleaning in the field, and she's gleaning what? She's gleaning barley. Now that tells us what time of year it is, as I'll explain here in the next slide. What the crop is tells us what season it is, and what month, somewhere around close to what month it is. So next time you read your Bible, this is going to start to jump out at you. When you'll read a phrase, it'll say, during the wheat harvest, such and such happened. You'll know what they're talking about. You'll know what time of year it is. Or they may say it's during the fruit harvest, or they may say they went out and got some barley, and you'll know what season that is. By the way, the little boy that had 5 loaves and 2 fishes, remember that? In the feeding of the 5,000, what kind of loaves did he have? He had barley loaves. That tells you something about what time of year it is, and we talk about that in the book. So, all right, everything in Israel revolved around the harvest. See, they didn't have a Walmart. They didn't have Kroger or IGA. If you wanted food, you had to grow it, or you had to go into town and you had to barter for it. Very important. A little different than today. Everything still revolves around food. You've got to eat, or you'll die. And so there has to be farmers. There has to be people who prepare the food. There has to be a way to store the food and market the food and transport the food. And just like there's a way to grow the food, right? So, all right, there are 3, everything revolves around the harvest, but there are 3 major harvests in Israel that I want you to understand. Here they are. The barley harvest. Number 2, the wheat harvest. I don't know if you can see my pointer. You probably can't, but my pointer's on the 2 there. The barley harvest, the wheat harvest, and the fruit harvest. Those are the 3 main harvests in Israel in Bible days. So this is important. Get that now. 3 major harvests that everything revolved around. Your life If you were alive in those days, your life revolved around these harvests right here. The barley, the wheat, and the fruit. All right, the barley would take place during Passover and first fruits. We'll look at that more closely in the next slide, but barley harvest would be during Passover time. So that's where we get the term Abib. The determining of Abib in the Bible is talking about a stage of growth of the barley. And that's how they would reset their calendar every 3 or 4 years. By the barley harvest, they would determine Abib, which would determine Passover. So, all right, the wheat harvest would be during Pentecost, which is 49 days after the Feast of First Fruits. And you got Passover, unleavened bread, and Feast of First Fruits all take place in 3 days. Passover, and then that night is unleavened bread, and then 2 days later, 3 days later is the Feast of First Fruits on the first day of the week. All right, and that's the fruit harvest. Those 3 harvests take place around those feast days, 3 of the feast days. All right, so we're going to find that the 7 feasts of the Lord in Leviticus chapter 23, there are 7 feasts mentioned. Here they are. You got there listed on the left there on the screen are the 7 feasts. And they're in order: Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, Pentecost, trumpets or Rosh Hashanah, Day of Atonement, we call that, the Jews call that Yom Kippur, and the Feast of Tabernacles or the Feast of Weeks, another name for that. So notice on the right there, these 7 feasts of the Lord, which are so important. By the way, the 7 feasts of the Lord is God's prophetic calendar. The 7 feasts of the Lord, Leviticus 23, are a biblical calendar built into the Bible. And so notice that these 3 feasts intertwine with the 7, these 3 harvests, I should say, are intertwined with the 7 feasts. Look on the left. Passover, unleavened bread, and first fruits all take place in a three-day period. During what? In the spring, during barley harvest. Now this would be March or April on our calendar, usually March, early April. Sometime late March, early April, somewhere in there. Barley harvest takes place right there. 49 days later, a month and 19 days later, would be the Feast of Pentecost. That is in the summertime now. Early summer, the wheat harvest, okay? Then the fall fruit harvest would take place during the last 3 feasts, which is trumpets, Day of Atonement, tabernacles, which take place in a 15-day period of the fall month of Tishri, beginning on day 1 for Feast of Trumpets, day 10th is Day of Atonement, and day 15th, the beginning of tabernacles, which lasts for 7 days. This is all fruit harvest time. Now, there's something interesting about these 3 harvests and these feast days that go along with them. And that's the fact that all Jewish men, 18 of mature age, 18 and above, all the Jewish men were required, commanded, to assemble in Jerusalem for these 3 feasts, for these 3 harvest times. Let me show you here. 3 times in the year, all you Jewish men were required to assemble in Jerusalem. And the 3 times they were to assemble would be the Feast of Unleavened Bread. See that on the left? I highlighted it. Unleavened bread. This is in Leviticus, or Exodus chapter 23. Let me go ahead and read that real quick. Exodus 23, verses 14 through 17 says this: 3 times thou shalt keep a feast unto me in the year. Now there's 7 feasts, but 3 of those feasts had a significance with the men assembling in Jerusalem. In Jerusalem. Verse 14, 3 times thou shalt keep a feast unto me in the year. Thou shalt keep the Feast of Unleavened Bread. There's number 1. See, I highlighted it there. Keep the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Thou shalt eat unleavened bread 7 days as I commanded thee in the time appointed in the month of Abib. And of course, Abib is the month Nisan. It's called Abib because Abib is a stage of growth of the barley. And it cannot be Abib unless the barley is at that certain stage. The barley has to be within a week to 10 days of being ripe, ready to harvest. And Abib is announced, which would begin day 1 of the month Abib, Nisan. Passover would be 14 days later. So in other words, the barley has to be ready to harvest for the Feast of First Fruits, which is right after Passover. So there has to be barley if it's Passover month. It has to be a bib. That's why it's called a bib. Nisan is called a bib in the Bible 6 times, and the word Nisan is only used 2 times when they're outside of Israel in captivity. All right. Verse 16, and the feast of harvest, the first fruits of thy labors, which thou hast sown in thy field. This is Pentecost. Talks about the feast of ingathering, which is in the end of the year, when thou hast gathered in thy labors in the field. 3 times in the year all thy males shall appear before the Lord. So the three times are mentioned there, and that's unleavened bread, Pentecost, and tabernacles. Tabernacles being the ingathering. All right, tabernacles is in the fall. So these 3 times, all the Jewish men were required to be in Israel. All right, now let's go a little further here. So these 3 harvests, see how important they are? All the men have to be in Israel during the unleavened bread, Pentecost, and tabernacles, which just happen to be the 3 main harvest times in Israel: barley, wheat, and fruit. Okay, the 7 feasts take place during 7 months of the biblical calendar. The feast days, the 7 feasts, Leviticus 23, begin in the month of Abib, and they end in the month Tishri. That's a 7-month period of their Jewish calendar. From the month of Abib or Nisan to the month Tishri is 7 months. You know, it's interesting that there are 7 colors in the rainbow. That number 7 is important to God. Did you know there are 7 notes on a musical scale? Did you know that there will be 7,000 years of human history from Genesis 1 to Revelation 22? 7,000 years of history. 4,000 in the Old Testament, 2,000 in the church age, the 1,000-year Sabbath, sabbatical rest, the millennium, the kingdom age. 7 days of creation, Genesis 1. And let me close with this. The 3 phases of the harvest. Just as there were 3 main harvests, there were 3 phases to the harvesting of a crop in Bible days. So there are 3 harvests, and there's 3 phases to harvesting a crop. Okay, and it doesn't matter what the crop is, whether it's fruit, wheat, or barley. There are 3 phases to harvesting that crop. This is important. The harvest is a type of the bodily resurrection, which shall also be in 3 stages. See, the harvesting of a crop is figurative of the harvesting of the resurrection, the body of men. We miss so much because we're not farmers. Here's the 3 stages of a harvest. See them 1, 2, 3 there. First fruits, main harvest, and gleanings. Boy, this would help you if you're struggling with the pre-trib rapture, if you don't understand and you're confused about the second coming of Christ. This will help you. There are 3 stages to the resurrection. Number 1, Christ is the first fruits. Did you know Christ is the first to bodily rise from the grave? He's the first to do that. Christ is the first fruits. He's the first fruits unto God. Then the second harvest is the main harvest. I believe the main harvest is the rapture. That's when the bodies of men will join their spirit and their soul in heaven. And that's the main harvest, which is the rapture that's going to happen at the end of the church age. Then there's one more, and that's called the gleanings. That takes place at the end of the tribulation. You'll see how some are confused by that in Matthew 24. They're actually seeing the gleanings, and they think that's the pre-trib rapture, and it's not. Or some call it the post-trib rapture. It's a rapture, but it's not the rapture the church is looking for. This is the rapture at the end of the tribulation of all the bodies of those who've been martyred and those who are still alive when he comes on the white horse in Revelation 19:11. So the gleanings are at the end of the tribulation. So it's important to understand that. There are 3 harvests: the barley, the wheat, and the fruit. There are 3 stages to harvesting a crop. They would go out into the field. When the crop is ready, what's the first thing they do? They get the first fruits and they offer it unto God. They go down to the temple or wherever and they offer that to God. Later on, the main harvest, it might only be a week later, the main harvest is gotten out of the field. But they were commanded to leave some behind. It's called the gleanings. Now, we don't do that anymore. Today, they get a big John Deere tractor. There's no first fruits, and most people don't honor God anyway. They wipe the whole field off, take it to the market, and it's gone. No gleanings. But in Bible days, you were commanded to leave some gleanings behind for the poor. That was, I like to look at it as God's welfare system. God took care of the poor that way. Now the rich had to leave some behind, but the rich were not, Boaz was not commanded to bag up those gleanings, put them in, get on a wagon, deliver it to the house, take the bag inside, stack it in their closet, maybe pull some out, cook it on the stove, and bring it in while they're watching TV and feed them. No, he was commanded to leave some, but the poor were commanded, if they wanted to eat, they had to go and work and labor in that man's field and glean in the field and get what he could. It's a good system, by the way. And the welfare system today ought to be designed a little bit like that. So, first fruits, main harvest, gleanings. How does that apply to us? There are 3 phases to the resurrection. Christ is the first phase. The rapture is the second phase, the main harvest. And then there's a gleanings at the end. I hope that's a help to you. I know it is to me. I hope it'll be a help to you as well. Of course, there's 2 resurrections. There's a resurrection of the lost and the damned, and then there's a resurrection of the saved. And woe unto him who's not part of the first resurrection. The second resurrection is the great white throne. And you do not want to be at that. I hope that you're born again. Hope you've trusted Christ as your Savior. Hope you know Jesus and are ready to be taken to heaven and in that bodily resurrection called the rapture. All right, give us some feedback if what you think of the new setup here in the studio. We'd sure like to hear from you. Tell us if the lighting's bad or if there's something that bothered you about the screen. Maybe there's something different we need to do here. So, all righty, I'll let it go from there. And please give us some feedback. And have a good night. We'll talk to you later.